Peter won the violin competition, and I hurried to the celebration banquet. But I overheard someone asking him, "Who is the girl with a Porsche 3.23 on your WeChat?" Peter nonchalantly replied, "It's just as it says." My hand froze on the door handle. My car is a red Porsche. My birthday is March 23rd. Chapter 1. Before I could escape, another voice came from the private room. "I heard you have a childhood sweetheart, and her birthday is in March." Peter remained silent for a moment, then vaguely replied, "Ha. Her grades are mediocre. She's tone deaf and can't even read a musical score. How could I possibly like her? She's just infatuated on her own, playing the doormat role with enthusiasm." I couldn't help but laugh at myself. After 24 years of growing up with Peter, all I got in return was the title of doormat. Indeed, Peter has always been a star in school. He would ignore classes and skip studying, yet ace every exam. In his spare time, he would climb up to the sports field's fence, playing the violin from above, drawing countless girls' screams. In our senior year, Peter caused quite a stir. Despite getting grades good enough for a top university, he whimsically chose a music conservatory. He laughed wildly. "Wherever a genius goes, that's where the stage is." And he indeed had the confidence and capability to be arrogant. In just a few years, he had won the Poseidon International Music Competition's gold medal. The media hailed him as the violinist with a genius IQ. In contrast, I was much dimmer. My grades were average, and I had no musical talent. The only thing worth mentioning was that I was pretty, outgoing, and well liked at school, even being elected as student council president. So after graduating from college, I didn't pursue further studies but started working directly. As for Peter, it was no surprise that he went on to graduate school. When he moved into a new dorm, I took time off to help him move his things. But when we arrived at the dormitory, Peter stopped me from going upstairs. "I'll move it all myself. You can head back." I was stunned and, after a moment, asked, "Do you think that as your girlfriend, I'm particularly embarrassing in your circle of elite musicians?" Peter helplessly tapped my nose. "What are you thinking? I'm just keeping you hidden so they won't covet my pretty wife." Later on, whenever I wanted to meet his classmates, Peter always found excuses to refuse. Until this time, Peter thought I was still abroad for a conference, so he posted the banquet's location on his social media. Inside the private room, the conversation had already shifted to Fritz Kreisler and Menuhin Max. It was a world I could never blend into. Just as I was about to make my escape, the door to the private room suddenly swung open. A girl in a white fairy dress looked me up and down with a hint of arrogance. "Hey! Who are you? Did you get the wrong room?" Chapter 2. There was a brief silence in the room as Peter's gaze landed on me. He seemed flustered for a moment, but quickly composed himself. "When did you get here? Weren't you in Manhattan for a meeting?" I hesitated for 0.1 seconds before casually replying. "Just got here, was looking for the room." Even I couldn't explain my behavior. Maybe it was my instinct as a business director, always leaving a way out, never easily showing my last card. Or maybe it was a last attempt to deceive myself, thinking that as long as I didn't expose it, there was still room for things to turn around. Peter smiled and introduced me to everyone. "This is Judy. She's a friend of mine." Friend. I chewed over that word. A bitter taste spread at the back of my tongue. The atmosphere in the room was subtle, and everyone's gaze fell on my car keys, their expressions turning into ones of sudden realization. But the girl in the white dress quickly broke the balance. "Haha, Judy, are you Peter's doormat?" Before I could react, Peter had already calmly stepped between us. "Mary, you're always so chatty. Your little mouth is always yapping. Now go eat something." It seemed like he was stopping her on the surface, but his words revealed a hint of affection and protectiveness. Mary playfully stuck her tongue out at Peter and ran off to the fruit platter. Mary, this name wasn't unfamiliar to me. For the past 6 months, Peter had often mentioned her. He mentioned that the school had welcomed a pianist who studied abroad, a girl named Mary. In terms of musicality and talent, she was in no way inferior to him. Now, she's the professor's favorite. He half-jokingly complained, I feel like I've fallen out of favor. Though it was a complaint, I could always sense a mutual respect between them. At that moment, one of Peter's classmates called me to sit down and casually joked. Peter, with such a beautiful friend, why haven't you introduced her to us? If you don't want her, you might as well let her into the market. Peter's face instantly darkened, and he quietly spat out a single word, get lost. The atmosphere in the room reached a peak of awkwardness. Peter casually took the scarf I'd draped over the chair and placed it over my legs. That dress could easily get you into a gala. Dressing like this is over the top. Plus, it's not safe to wear that at night. I'll drive you home later. I was just about to laugh and explain when Mary suddenly let out a startled "oh." Peter quickly turned his head. Mary held a fruit knife in one hand, while the other had a small cut, with a bit of blood seeping out. Peter immediately panicked. I told you, your hands are meant for playing the piano. Whenever you want something to eat, haven't I always peeled it for you? Chapter 3. Mary looked aggrieved. Why are you so fierce? I was just afraid Judy would get upset. As she spoke, her eyes started to turn red. She had that I want to cry, but I'm holding back tears look that you'd find in a romance novel. Peter suddenly looked up at me, his gaze filled with undeniable blame. But I hadn't done anything at all. Why would just 2 sentences from her make you assume that I'm the culprit? Favoritism can be blatant, but how can you be so blind? At that moment, Peter, looking panicked, picked up Mary. I'll take you to the hospital. As he passed by me, Mary's seemingly limp leg suddenly moved, and one foot almost kicked me in the face. Instinctively, I leaned back, only to find a chair lying sideways behind me. Caught off guard, I fell awkwardly and let out a small cry of pain. Peter paused, seemingly about to check on me. But Mary weakly said, Sorry, Judy, I didn't mean to. It's just that my hand hurts so much. I'm really scared I won't be able to play the piano anymore. Peter furrowed his brow and comforted her softly. Don't be afraid, I'll take you to the hospital right away. Your fall isn't her fault, it's all because she's so vain, always insisting on wearing high heels. With that, he walked away without looking back. The room fell into a heavy silence, almost suffocating. After a long pause, one of Peter's classmates awkwardly said, Peter didn't really mean. He hesitated, as if he couldn't find the right words, and instead asked if I needed to go to the hospital. I shook my head in refusal and limped my way to the underground parking lot. Vanity. I can't deny that I am indeed vain. I worked tirelessly in my career, climbing to the position of business director in less than 3 years. I always strive to be first in everything, always wanting to outshine others. Buying the best house, driving the best car, wearing Chanel suits, and the diamond ring must be over 3 carats. I've always been one to embrace the new and discard the old, chasing after the expensive and rejecting the cheap. It seems the only thing I'm sentimental about in life is Peter. When I was young, my parents divorced and each formed new families. Neither wanted me, treating me like a ball they could kick around. If I wanted money for living expenses, I had to endure their sneers and cold stares. The only solace back then was Peter. He would play the violin gently when I cried in the stairwell. He would share his breakfast buns and milk with me. When kids at school called me a wild child that no one wanted, he would resolutely shield me behind him. I lacked love from an early age, and he was the only warmth in my life. That's why I couldn't let go all these years. A sharp, lewd whistle interrupted my thoughts. Unknowingly, I had already walked into the deserted underground parking lot. A group of flashy, rowdy thugs was taunting me. Hey, beautiful, all alone? Wow, driving a Porsche, too. Must be someone's mistress, right? If you can keep one man company, why not keep us company too? Chapter 4. They were already walking towards me, and I instinctively stepped back, fumbling for my car keys. In my panic, the car keys slipped from my hand. Just as I was about to bend down to pick them up, a slender, bony hand suddenly appeared and snatched them up first. A hand lightly rested on my shoulder. I told you to wait for me. Why did you come down by yourself again? I looked up and saw an unfamiliar face. He looked under 30, wearing a simple white t-shirt and jeans. But on his wrist was a limited edition Vacheron Constantin, the kind of watch money can't buy. Besides that, he had no other accessories. The gang of hooligans on the side were cursing as they backed off. The man, acting naturally, opened my car door. "Get in, it's cold outside." As he spoke, he sat in the driver's seat, casually took out his phone, sent a message, and then started the car. It wasn't until the car drove into the brightly lit street that he spoke. "In urgent situations, one must be flexible. Sorry for the sudden move." "Don't worry, I'm not a bad person. Shall I take you home?" I forced a smile. "I know, that watch of yours is worth more than my car. Thanks for your help just now." Following my directions, he steered the car onto the ring road, considerately remaining silent so I could close my eyes and rest. Soon, we arrived at my place. Feeling a bit awkward, I said, "How will you get home? How about I call a car for you?" The man smiled. "No need, my assistant is picking me up. The car has been following us all along." I looked up and saw a black Bentley pulling up beside him. A person who looked like an assistant handed him a bag. "CEO Scott, here's what you requested." The man took the bag and handed it to me. "Your knee is scraped. I got you some medicine and bandages. But if it's serious, you should go to the hospital." It was only then that I realized the pain in my knee from the fall earlier. The man turned and opened the car door. "Get inside quickly. Girls should be more careful at night. Or maybe have your boyfriend pick you up." I couldn't help but force a bitter smile. "My boyfriend is very busy." Seeing the man get into his car, I hurriedly thanked him again. "Thank you so much for tonight." The man looked at me, smiling mischievously. "You're welcome, Judy." With that, his car sped away. I was left stunned. How did he know who I am? Chapter 5. From my experience, after Peter and I have a fight, there's usually a few days of silent treatment. When I can't take it anymore and make the first move, he always gives the same cold response. "Do you realize what you did wrong? What was it? Will it happen again?" But for some reason, this time after our argument, I didn't feel the same urge to check my phone every few minutes. Nor did I want to contact him first. What I didn't expect was that this time, Peter was the one to apologize. It all started with a video that went viral. During my trip to Manhattan for a meeting, I made time to visit the famous Kolstein violin shop. I wanted to pick out a nice violin for Peter as a gift. While I was browsing, I happened to run into a popular vlogger from back home who was live streaming. She excitedly interviewed me. "Wow, you're buying such an expensive violin. You must be an amazing musician. Could you play something for us?" I smiled calmly and said, "I'm tone deaf. This violin is for my boyfriend. He's amazing." After the video went viral, many netizens left comments. "So jealous of her boyfriend. A $340,000 violin, bought without even blinking. The girl is so beautiful. Her eyes light up when she talks about her boyfriend. When you're ready to change boyfriends, can you kick me? I'd like to get in line." With this, Peter finally pieced together the truth. I had rushed to buy him a violin after my Manhattan meeting. Then, without any rest, I hurried back, not even adjusting to the time difference, or having time to change my clothes. I couldn't wait to see him, only to become the punchline of a joke. Peter finally couldn't hold back and texted me. "Are you there? Let's have dinner tonight." Even in his apology, the aloof god maintained a hint of condescension. But I still shamefully replied, "Sure." Chapter 6. I initially thought it would be a candlelight dinner for just the two of us. Who would have guessed it would turn into a wild party? Peter took me to a bar. Mary spotted us immediately and waved to Peter. "Over here." Peter smiled and pulled me along, completely ignoring the fact that my expression had gone from sunny to stormy. After a few rounds of drinks, Peter got up to use the restroom. Just then, someone mentioned the video and gave me a thumbs up. Impressive. $340,000, the most expensive violin in the entire school. Before I could say anything, Mary let out a sneer. What's the big deal about spending money on a man? A real achievement is when a man is willing to spend money on you. As she spoke, she casually touched her neck. A diamond necklace was gleaming there, flaunting its presence. Mary leaned in and whispered provocatively. Peter gave it to me. What has he ever given you? He even needs to write down your birthday to remember it, let alone give you any gifts, right? The one who isn't loved is the third party. I smiled, my fingers casually tracing circles on the rim of my glass. H color, 1 carat. Just barely presentable, probably bought on discount? But based on what I know about Peter, he's not exactly flush with cash. Where did he get the money to buy Mary diamonds? Mary seemed to be provoked. Peter and I are a perfect match, made for each other. The moment I saw him, I was determined to have him. I saw Peter walking out of the restroom from a distance. An expensive suit, a finely tailored shirt, and regularly maintained skin and hands. Elegant like a prince. A prince meticulously packaged by the foolish Cinderella who worked herself to the bone. Indeed, he holds immense allure in the still tender world of academia. I swirled my glass. Little sister, what you like isn't Peter. It's the persona that I spent money to create. Unfortunately, she didn't understand my kind advice. Instead, a glint of malice flashed in her eyes, and she suddenly grabbed my hand and the glass, downing the entire drink herself. Then she started coughing violently, with tears in her eyes as she cried to the approaching Peter. I can't drink, but she forced me to. She said if I didn't drink, she'd make me. Her acting was as clumsy as a cheap street performance. Yet someone was willing to buy it. Without thinking, Peter reached out and pushed me. Judy, enough. Mary even suggested that I bring you here to relax. How can you compare to her? She's just a young girl. How can she handle alcohol? I suddenly grabbed the hand he used to push me and looked at his now empty wrist. I asked each word clearly. Where is the couple's watch I gave you? Chapter 7. Peter was instantly speechless. His face darkened as he pulled his hand back, trying to sound tough. Once you give it to me, it's mine. Why do you care so much? As he spoke, his eyes couldn't help but glance at Mary's diamond necklace. I almost laughed in anger. You sold the watch I gave you to buy gifts for a little girl? I spoke loud enough that everyone nearby turned to look. Peter's classmates gaped at him, staring in disbelief. It seemed they couldn't fathom that their usually noble and elegant Prince Charming would do such a thing. In fact, I didn't care about the money. But that watch held immense significance for me. I was the one who confessed to Peter first. From start to finish, his attitude was always one of whatever. Being together was fine, breaking up was fine, and finding someone else would be fine too. Until one time, on my birthday, Peter happened to be performing out of town. I was downcast, buying myself a cake and blowing out the candles alone. But just as the clock struck midnight, a gentle violin melody suddenly floated through my window. I couldn't believe it and poked my head out. Peter was downstairs, still wearing his slightly crumpled performance outfit. He looked up at me with a little smugness in his eyes, as if saying, "Surprised, aren't you?" Peter was always so aloof, and that was one of the few times he showed a bit of youthful charm. It hit me right in the heart. Later, we shared the entire cake together. He nestled against my neck, a little pitiful. I rushed back as soon as the performance ended. I even hitched a ride on a donkey cart. Just to make it back for your birthday. Peter told me that the violin piece that night was his original composition. He called it adorned in splendor. After Peter left, I happily twirled around the room a few times. I thought, maybe Peter does have feelings for me. The next day, I used my project bonus to buy a pair of couples watches. Peter looked surprised when he received it. It's not even a holiday. Why such an expensive gift all of a sudden? I gleefully took his hand, and the two watches on our wrists reflected each other. You don't understand. That scene is still vivid in my mind, but it's something I can never return to. Seeing the strange, even slightly disdainful looks around him, Peter finally lost his patience. Enough. I'll cash it out and return the money to you. We're breaking up. Chapter 8. The day after we broke up, Peter got together with Mary. Their public announcement was grand. They even filmed a VCR and posted it on Weibo. In the video, one of them was playing the piano, and the other was playing the violin. As the notes danced, they exchanged glances every now and then, filled with endless understanding. Fans flooded the comments with blessings. Wow, two musical geniuses together. Congratulations. Will their future child be able to pass the grade 8 piano exam right after birth? Even the media joined the fun, a perfect match. Like mountains and rivers meeting a soulmate. I smiled and commented below, respect and blessings. But maybe you should return the money first. No reply came, and later, my comment was deleted. Alright then, if that's how you want to play it. Just as I was rolling up my sleeves, ready to passionately start typing, a WeChat notification popped up. Judy, this is the HR you were in talks with earlier. Didn't you say you were considering our company? Our CEO Scott just reached out to you. Are you available for an interview? I stared at the HR message, lost in thought. Should I jump into this pit? After hesitating for a while, I decided to take the risk of embarrassing myself and accepted the video interview. Two familiar faces appeared on the screen. One was the HR I had been in contact with before. The other was the man who had helped me out in the parking lot. The HR introduced him as the company's CEO, Scott. After a moment of shock, I quickly composed myself. CEO Scott, what a coincidence. Thank you for your help the other day. Scott was dressed in a proper suit today, nodding seriously with a stern expression. You're welcome. Let's begin the interview. I nodded in agreement. At the same time, I realized that no wonder Scott knew who I was that day. He must have already received my resume and seen my photo. Actually, the interview was just a formality. This company is a subsidiary of a large group, and they just entered City A this year, currently assembling a team. Coincidentally, I had previously collaborated with the group's CEO, who had extended an olive branch to me early on. The benefits here are 3 times higher than my current job, with more room for growth. However, since the subsidiary has an independent CEO, a newly returned elite from abroad, we needed to see if we were compatible. Fortunately, Scott is a very measured leader. He knows what the company needs for growth, but he doesn't interfere excessively in my professional domain. In the end, we reached an agreement. Scott's expression was firm, exuding the authority of someone in a high position. Welcome aboard. I was stunned for a moment, thinking he might have some issues. But it's just a job, no need to set the bar too high. After all, I put up with Peter for so many years, so what's the harm in dealing with a faulty ATM that spits out money? After we agreed on my start date, we politely ended the call. But my phone lagged for a moment and wouldn't let me exit the call. As I frantically tapped on my phone, I witnessed a rather explosive scene. Scott first tugged on his tie in a very boss-like manner, then jumped 3 feet in the air. She said yes. It wasn't in vain that I changed into a suit to highlight my professionalism as a CEO. My eyes widened in shock. Who in their right mind only wears the top half of a suit? And paired it with chicken-patterned shorts, no less. By the time I finally managed to restart my phone, HR's desperate WeChat messages were flooding in. Do you wear glasses? No offense, but our company just introduced an eye care subsidy. If you're nearsighted, you can get free glasses every year. Wait. Why did you turn off your phone? Please listen to me. Our boss is just as happy as a 200-pound child. And he's not familiar with video conference systems. But we are a legitimate company. I struggled to suppress my laughter and replied. Thank you, but I don't have nearsightedness. Both my eyes have perfect vision. Chapter 9. A month later, I completed the resignation process and started at my new company. The first project was quite challenging. The client we were dealing with, Mr. Wang, was someone I had crossed paths with before. He was an oily, difficult man with a beer belly, and he kept his pinky nail long. At the dinner table, after downing a bottle of white liquor, he started telling dirty jokes, sparing no details. Scott and I exchanged a few glances, both of us feeling a bit nauseated. Taking advantage of his drunkenness, Mr. Wang reached for my hand, saying, Judy, I really admire you. You're beautiful, and also. Just then, Scott casually said, Judy, could you open the door? It's a bit stuffy in here. Simultaneously, he discreetly blocked Mr. Wang's lecherous hand. I took the opportunity to get up and open the door, only to be caught off guard by the sight of Peter and Mary. They seemed to have just had an argument, keeping a 2-meter distance between them, neither making eye contact nor speaking. I hadn't planned on saying anything, but Peter looked up and, with a hint of surprise in his voice, said, "Judy? What are you doing here?" Hearing this, Mary looked up, and the resentment in her eyes was evident. Peter took a few steps forward, seemingly wanting to say more to me. Unexpectedly, Mr. Wang, wobbling and belching, stumbled over. He squinted at Peter and said, "Oh, I know you. Aren't you the boy toy Judy used to keep? She used to buy you all kinds of things." Peter, with his fragile pride, looked like he was about to burst into flames. "I'm a violinist, not a boy toy." I had a bad feeling about this. But I didn't expect things to go as wrong as they did. Mr. Wang nodded in understanding, then gave a thumbs up. "Got it. A street performer." Chapter 10. The scene that day got pretty chaotic. Furious, Peter tackled Mr. Wang and started pummeling him. Mary played the role of the atmosphere group, screaming incessantly. In the chaos, Scott blocked a bottle of wine that was flying straight at me. I looked at the man who had unhesitatingly shielded me and hadn't even had time to feel touched before. There was a loud bang. Poor CEO Scott had unfortunately been struck by the bottle, and a beautiful bruise blossomed on his temple. I hurried to support him, leaning in to check his forehead. Unexpectedly, Scott stared wide-eyed at me for 3 seconds before. A warm stream suddenly ran down my cheek, and I touched the blood on my face in astonishment. This guy had actually gotten a nosebleed? Across from me, Scott covered his nose, blushing furiously, sorry. I was at a loss for how to respond. Great, the scene was even more chaotic now. It wasn't until the driver arrived that the brawl finally ended. Once sober, Mr. Wang immediately called the police. The police arrived, assessed the situation, and confirmed that Peter had thrown the first punch. They then asked Mr. Wang, "Are you willing to mediate?" Mr. Wang, clutching his beer belly, cursed, "Mediation my ass. That little bastard, I want him behind bars." Peter, only now realizing the seriousness of the situation, panicked, "Judy." I was busy asking the waiter for a towel to press against Scott's forehead and didn't pay him any attention. "What? Now that you've caused a scene, you know how to call out for help?" The police, puzzled, looked at me and asked, "What's your relationship with him?" Hearing this, Peter stared at me intently. I smiled, calm and collected, "Ex-boyfriend. Practically enemies." Peter clenched his fist so hard his knuckles cracked. Peter had been impulsive and gotten into fights before, and I had helped him smooth things over. He seemed to think it wasn't that difficult. It was just a matter of apologizing and compensating them, after all. But now, why should I help him? Adults have to take responsibility for their actions. Chapter 11. Since Mr. Wang refused to mediate and the opposing legal team got involved, Peter was likely to face criminal charges. Eventually, Peter's parents rushed over. Having been teachers all their lives and never having bowed their heads, they finally had to compromise for the sake of their son. Both looked weary and weathered, bowing and apologizing to Mr. Wang. For the first time in his life, Peter's father resorted to violence, slapping Peter before forcing him to apologize by pressing down on the back of his neck. Peter's eyes were bloodshot, and after a long pause, he finally squeezed out a humiliating "I'm sorry." Eventually, Mr. Wang accepted the money Peter's parents had scraped together, and the matter was settled. Peter's school decided to keep him, taking his talent into account. However, they gave him a severe warning, and the incident was reported school-wide. As for Mary, she didn't show up at all during the ordeal, claiming she was sick and resting at home. It wasn't until everything was over that she returned to school, clinging to Peter and crying her heart out. She even posted a couple's photo on social media with the caption, "I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you during your toughest times. But don't worry, I won't miss any more important moments in the future." In the picture, Peter was being hugged by Mary, looking lifeless, his expression bordering on numbness. It was during lunch when I saw it, biting into a sandwich and laughing so hard the office roof almost flew off. A moment later, the office door creaked open just a crack, and Scott's head awkwardly squeezed through. "Need a lunch, buddy?" I stared at him, dumbfounded. Before I could say anything, he had already made himself at home, bringing in 2 enormous lunch boxes and sitting down across from me. I gave him a thumbs up. "CEO Scott, you've got quite the appetite." "Impressive." Scott choked for a moment before sighing. "You're just as silly as you were when you were a kid." I frowned, puzzled, and looked at him. Scott seemed a bit disappointed, lowering his head. "Do you remember the outsider family that moved into the courtyard when we were kids?" I was shocked. "The mute brother? How did you learn to speak? A medical miracle?" Scott held back his frustration, barely resisting the urge to smash the lunchbox over my head. "I was never mute." Chapter 12. When we were kids, the children in the courtyard banded together and were hostile towards outsiders. At one point, a family moved in, a couple with a boy 2 or 3 years older than us. Rumor had it that they had returned from abroad to handle some family matters. Naturally, the boy became the target of bullying. Later, everyone noticed that no matter what they did, the boy never spoke. They speculated that he was mute, and the bullying intensified. At that time, my parents' divorce made me an outcast in the courtyard too. Other than Peter, no one wanted to play with me, and they even teased me. Initially, I was relieved by the boy's presence because I was bullied less after he arrived. Once, some kids even invited me to join them in tormenting him. They had long discovered that the boy was particularly afraid of moths. So, they caught dozens of enormous, flapping moths. The largest one was almost the size of a child's hand. When the adults weren't around, the group quietly approached the boy's window. They threw the bag full of moths inside and immediately pressed against the window to prevent escape. Instantly, terrified screams echoed from the room. "Ah!" Everyone burst into laughter. Even a mute will scream when pushed too far. That day, I didn't participate. I was at home, on the phone with Peter, who was away at his summer camp. Hearing the commotion, I rushed downstairs. The kids had already fled, leaving behind the faint sounds of sobbing and the flapping of wings inside the room. Thanks to my small size, I managed to squeeze through the window. The room was filled with moths, making my skin crawl. In the corner, the boy was curled up, hugging his knees and sobbing. A giant moth had settled on the tip of his nose. Help! I was terrified too. But recalling how I was usually bullied, I mustered the courage to approach and tried to shoo away the moths. Only to have a moth flap right into my face, terrifying me to the point of fainting. That night, I developed a fever. The doctor said it was due to extreme fright. By the time I recovered, the mute brother and his family had already moved away. As I grew older, I almost forgot about this incident. Who would have thought that the pitiful boy from back then would become my boss now? Scott said that after I fainted, he was completely stunned. And yet, I was still stubbornly mumbling words of comfort. "Mute brother, don't be afraid. They're just moths. I'll protect you." We stared at each other for a long time in silence before I shakily spoke. "To be honest, I've cringed so hard that I've built a whole villa with my toes. With a basement and an attic, no less. Where did my younger self get that kind of courage from?" Scott laughed. "But I still need to thank you. Back then, I had autism and hardly spoke. When you fainted, I was afraid something might happen to you, so I called for help. When my parents heard me speak, they were almost in tears. Later, they took me abroad, and when I wanted to find you, I couldn't get in touch. Until this time when I returned to the country for a job, and received the resume for the vice president of business position from the head office. The familiar name, with the vaguely recognizable features in the photo. It finally confirmed for him that I was indeed the girl who had caused such a sensation back then. Chapter 13. Moments later, Scott handed me a lunchbox. "This is for you. I noticed you eat sandwiches and black coffee every day for lunch. It's not good for your stomach. Try my cooking." Inside the lunchbox was a delicious-looking mix of beef with potatoes, spinach vermicelli, and 3 large peeled shrimp. Scott had even thoughtfully included blueberries and strawberries as dessert next to the rice. I'm not naive, but I didn't know how to respond, so I just ate the meal eagerly. Scott waited leisurely on the other side of the table. After I finished eating, he naturally reached for the empty lunchbox to wash it. I quickly shielded the empty lunchbox. "Oh, no need. I can do it myself." Scott suddenly smiled at me. "It's all right, you don't need to rush. You're such a wonderful girl, you deserve to enjoy being cared for." In my stunned state, he took the empty lunchbox away. He smiled like a cat that had stolen cream, swaggering off to wash the dishes. At that moment, my phone suddenly vibrated, and a WeChat message popped up. "Peter, the other party transferred 0.01 yuan to you." I twitched my mouth. Is this an attempt to test whether I had deleted him, but accidentally backfired? Perhaps Peter also realized he had made a mistake, so he straightforwardly asked, "You didn't delete me. Are you still hung up on me?" I replied in frustration. "First, you haven't given me the money you promised to convert. Secondly, work is tiring, and I need to eat some gossip to relax." That's actually the truth. Previously, Mary added me on WeChat to show off. During this time, watching the two of them flaunt their guess the drawing game on WeChat has been quite relieving. Usually, it's Mary posting on her moments. "Wow. I really like this handbag. Help me choose a ring. My boyfriend promised to give it to me as a birthday gift. Which one looks better?" Then Peter replied, "If you like it, baby, just buy it." Soon after, Mary was completely satisfied with what she wanted. Meanwhile, Peter's moments clearly showed a significant decrease in activities like dining out or attending concerts. After replying to Peter, I went to a meeting. It wasn't until 3 hours later, when the meeting ended, that I had a chance to check my phone. Peter had already sent dozens of WeChat messages. All of them were complaints. He said Mary was unreasonable and often threw tantrums. Whenever she wanted to practice the piano, she wouldn't allow Peter to disturb her. But when Peter wanted to practice, Mary would coquettishly ask him to accompany her shopping, and if he refused, she would get angry and start an argument. Occasionally, Mary would even compare herself to me, insisting that Peter take her to the high-end private restaurants we used to visit. Peter, suppressing his impatience, told her that those restaurants only accepted members, and without me, he couldn't get in either. Mary didn't listen, insisting on having whatever the ex-girlfriend had. Little did she know that during my time with Peter, almost all expenses were paid by me. Also, he actually knew that when he was arrested by the police, Mary was just scared and didn't want to face it with him. He self-deprecatingly said that if he had really been imprisoned, Mary would have been the first to distance herself. At the end of the WeChat conversation, Peter, for the first time, lowered his head and showed weakness. "I regret it, Judy. Can we start over? The piano you bought for me has not been given to me yet. Let me play a beautiful piece for you again." I was very moved and then, terrified, deleted him. Whether or not he pays back the money doesn't matter. With the time spent entangled with him, I could have earned 10 times that amount. Besides, he probably doesn't know that the piano he brought back was already sold on a second-hand website. The money from the sale was used to buy 3 pairs of high heels, 2 suits, and a new long dress. Indeed, spending money on myself is the most satisfying. Chapter 14. Since I deleted Peter, the company seemed to be on a roll with contracts, and the monthly revenue exceeded 100 million. To this, Scott, with a hint of scheming, commented, "See? He was blocking your financial luck. If it were me, I wouldn't dare to keep a man like that." I asked with genuine curiosity. "So what kind of man do you like? Please, elaborate." Scott spat out a sip of tea. "Not quite what I meant." During this time, Scott brought me lunch every day and claimed that the lunch buddy culture was a fine tradition that needed to be carried forward. It would be a lie to say I'm not moved. When I was with Peter, I felt constantly tense and had a lingering sense of inferiority. But with Scott, I feel unusually relaxed. Sometimes, even if we don't talk, just being together while working on our own tasks doesn't make things awkward. Most of the time, he makes me feel like I'm basking in spring breeze, though occasionally, he also shows a bit of childishness in front of me. Just like now. I stared in shock at Scott and his gleaming Swona. This is the surprise you said you'd give me? Scott proudly lifted his head. Don't you like musicians? I can be one too. I've been practicing for a long time, now I'm super skilled. With that, he tidied up his hair, placed the suona to his lips, and took a deep breath. Then, a vigorous and resounding rendition of folk song of the homeland filled the entire room. I felt numb, shocked, and at a loss. He was excited, proud, and growing more enthusiastic. When the performance ended, he looked at me expectantly. How was it? Did you like it? Not wanting to hurt his fragile little heart, I could only solemnly nod. It's like heavenly music. Just as Scott was thrilled and seemed ready for an encore, a knock sounded at the door. I opened the door to find Peter, unshaven, standing there. Seeing me, his eyes lit up. Judy, I finally found you. Before I could say anything, a head appeared from behind him, resting on my shoulder and even daringly rubbing against me. Baby, who's this? I looked at Scott in disbelief. Are you trying to make him even angrier? Scott innocently blinked at me. Hee hee. I lost all my temper and could only coldly address the furious Peter. What's the matter? Peter, not answering the question, asked. Why is he here? Scott quickly pushed me aside, cheerfully answering. I'm here to cook for the baby. Peter clenched his fists, veins popping on his forehead. In the next second, Scott sneered, looking down from his high position. Trying to hit someone again? Little brat, only the most useless people resort to throwing punches. If you dare lay a hand on me, I'll make sure you go to jail. With that, he leaned on the doorframe with one hand, slightly bent forward to stare directly at Peter. I mean what I say. Scott shed the childish and gentle persona he showed in front of me, revealing the ruthless and decisive nature of the executive he was in the business world. At that moment, I finally realized. The mute brother who was autistic, silent, and afraid of moths as a child had, through the long years, cruelly healed himself. If he could, then am I not also no longer the unloved child of my youth? If one lacks love, why should they not love themselves? Peter's eyes were glistening with tears as he looked at me pleadingly. Judy, please. Give me another chance. The orchestra has sent me an invitation, promising me the lead position. I will become even better than him. Come back to me, okay? I carefully examined the Peter before me. He looked like he was not doing well. His clothes were wrinkled, likely because Mary hadn't ironed them, and he wouldn't do it himself. His once delicate skin was now greasy, with stubble that hadn't been shaved off. Without me paying for his skincare, he was no longer the noble prince he used to be. After a long pause, I finally smiled. Peter, do you think I'm always going to be that little girl who can't leave you? I used to accept your indifference, thinking that someday you would warm up. But when I discovered that at your core you've turned into a terrible person, what is there left for me to cling to? Grow up. I've already given up on you. I can accept all the sunk costs. You know I will never look back. Chapter 15. The next time I saw Peter's news, it was on the cafe's TV. That day, I was having afternoon tea with Scott. The TV suddenly aired a news segment. Genius violinist injured. His girlfriend arrested for assault. It turned out that at the banquet where Peter had joined the orchestra, he performed a piece of Glamorous in front of everyone. Just as everyone was applauding, Mary suddenly rushed out with a knife and struck Peter on the wrist. Blood poured out immediately. When Mary was apprehended by the police, she still smiled at the pale Peter and said, "Do you remember what I told you? You can't be better than me. Since I didn't become the lead, you naturally can't either." It wasn't until afterward that I learned Mary was extremely jealous. Not only was she dissatisfied with Peter's lingering feelings for me, but she was also enraged by his invitation to become the lead while she was left out. Her intense jealousy led her to decide to destroy Peter. The doctor who treated Peter spoke with some regret. "You won't be able to play the violin anymore. Actually, that girl didn't have much strength. If only you had worn a watch or something to block the blow. I see you have the marks of wearing a watch on your wrist, so why weren't you wearing it that day?" Peter was stunned for a moment upon hearing this, and then he cried. It was unclear whether he was crying over his fall from grace or over the fact that it all could have been avoided. Chapter 16. Mary was arrested for intentional injury and sentenced to prison. Peter fell into a deep depression and announced his withdrawal from school. People were full of sighs and comments. Two great talents have fallen, things have changed. To be honest, there's really only a step between genius and madness. It's terrifying. What kind of mentality makes one not want their partner to be better? Soon, a user with the ID "still cooking for my wife today" posted. Selfish love is too scary. I looked at Scott, who was earnestly commenting. How old are you? He covered his chest. Just promised to be someone's girlfriend, and now you're starting to complain about me. I couldn't help but laugh and cry. Speak properly. No pity parties allowed. It had only been a week since Scott and I got together. He had already managed to become disliked by the whole company. The secretary brought him some documents. CEO Scott, here's the new contract. Scott. Congratulations, congratulations. I'll definitely send you an invitation to my wedding with Judy. The cleaner asked him to move. Excuse me, CEO Scott. Scott. How did you know these were the shoes Judy bought for me? It was infuriating to the point of being universally condemned. The man across from me kept chattering on. Annoying, yet sweet. The evening sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a halo around him. Suddenly, on a whim, I tiptoed and kissed him. Scott was instantly frozen, and after a moment he stammered. Can I apply for another one? As I leaned in, he suddenly assumed a hoarse stance. I was stunned for a moment. Looking at Scott, perfectly positioned right in front of me, I finally smiled and kissed him. It was this man who told me. Everything you want is worth reaching for on tiptoe. Only love doesn't have to.